I remember that winter night as clearly as if it happened yesterday. I was 11 years old, living on the outskirts of a small, remote town in Alaska. Our house was on a lonely stretch, nestled between towering pines and barren winter fields. Snow piled up on either side of the road like walls. And at night, the darkness felt endless, only occasionally broken by the faint glow of our porch light. It was one of those nights when everything felt still, and the only sounds were the howling wind and the crackle of the wood-burning stove in our living room. My mom had just left for her night shift at the hospital, and my dad was away on a work trip. I was alone, but that wasn't unusual. In Alaska, you grow up learning to handle isolation. I was settled in with a blanket and a book when there was a loud knock on the door. The sound echoed through the empty house, making me jump. I put my book down and stared at the door, the heavy silence now broken by a second knock, this one louder and more insistent. Through the peephole, I saw a man, bundled in thick, heavy winter gear, a coat, scarf, and a beanie pulled low over his head. His face was red from the cold, and he held his hands to his mouth, blowing into them as if trying to warm them up. He looked like any traveler who might have gotten lost, or whose car might have broken down on the side of the road. But something in me hesitated. He knocked again, and then I heard his muffled voice through the door. "Hey there, sorry to bother you, but my car broke down a little way up the road. Any chance I could come in to warm up and maybe use a phone?" He sounded polite enough, even friendly, but as I watched him, an uneasy feeling grew in my stomach. Maybe it was the way he looked around, his eyes flickering to the windows, the dark trees, then back to the door, as if he were sizing up the place. Still, it was freezing outside, and my parents had always taught me to be helpful. I told myself I was overreacting and opened the door, though I kept the chain on. "I can call someone for you," I said, hoping he wouldn't insist on coming inside. But his eyes, cold and pale, held mine longer than I was comfortable with. "Thanks, kid, but it'd be a lot easier if I could just come in for a second. I won't be long, I swear," he said, his voice dropping, almost too calm. "I can get the phone and bring it to you here," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady for someone who felt a knot of fear growing tighter. He hesitated, his gaze hardening. "Come on," he said, his tone shifting to something darker. "It's freezing out here. I just need a few minutes." The way he said it made it sound less like a request and more like a demand. Suddenly he leaned forward, putting his hand on the door, and for a second, I thought he was going to force his way in. I took a step back, holding the door firmly. "That's okay," I stammered. "I'm calling for help now. They should be here soon." But he didn't budge, and the small smile he gave me was anything but friendly. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" he muttered under his breath. His eyes scanned the room behind me, lingering a bit too long on the darkness at my back. For a long moment, he stood there, his gaze chilling me more than the winter air. And then, he slowly backed away from the door, his eyes never leaving mine. Just as I thought he might finally give up, he spoke again, his voice even lower and more menacing. "You know, being alone out here isn't safe," he said. "You never know who might show up, or what they're capable of." My heart was pounding, but I kept my face neutral, refusing to show fear. I tightened my grip on the door, not daring to break eye contact. He seemed to study me, waiting, perhaps hoping that I'd let my guard down, but I didn't move. Eventually, with a small, twisted smirk, he turned and disappeared into the night, his shadow blending with the trees. I bolted the door and waited, listening intently, but there was only silence. Yet the silence felt wrong, too heavy, too oppressive. I checked every window, every lock, pacing the room, knowing I wouldn't feel safe until morning. Hours later, as dawn broke and the weak sunlight touched the snow outside, I finally dared to venture out. There, by the front door, were footprints, his footprints. They circled the house multiple times, leading from the woods to my windows and back again. And on one window, smudged by his hand, was a note, scratched in the frost. "I'll see you soon." I never saw the stranger again, but that night left its mark. To this day, the memory of that face, of those icy eyes watching from the shadows, lingers. Alaska has its own dangers, I learned that winter. And sometimes, the biggest threats aren't the animals or the elements. They're the people who come out of the dark, friendly on the surface but hiding something far colder beneath. It was around midnight when I found myself driving along a narrow, desolate road in Alaska, thick pines on either side casting long shadows across my headlights. I'd been on the road for hours, nothing but static on the radio and the hum of the engine to keep me company. I had about another 100 miles to go before reaching Fairbanks, where I'd planned to crash at a friend's place. The road was eerily empty. Not another car in sight, and not a single house light pierced through the thick darkness beyond the pines. I knew this route was infamous for its isolation, but something about the sheer emptiness that night felt different. Wrong, somehow. I was about halfway through a winding stretch when I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. Just standing there. The man looked like he'd been dropped in from another world, wearing a thick dark coat and an old-fashioned hat pulled low over his face. His head was slightly bowed, but as my car approached, he raised his face to look straight at me. I couldn't make out any details, just two faint glints in his eyes catching the light of my car. The sight sent a chill through me, but I tried to shake it off. I slowed down slightly, half thinking maybe he needed help, though a voice inside told me to keep driving. Just as I was passing him, he lifted his arm and pointed down the road, his finger tracing a long, invisible line into the dark. I caught a glimpse of his face in the light, pale and expressionless, his eyes dark pits that seemed to suck the warmth right out of me. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, leaving him in my rearview mirror as quickly as possible. But as I rounded the next bend, I realized he'd been pointing in the direction of a rusted old truck, parked just off the shoulder, partially hidden by the trees. Its headlights flicked on as I approached, blinding me for a moment before they turned off again. My heart pounded as I drove past it, keeping my eyes straight ahead. The last thing I wanted was to stop or look back. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, my high beams cutting through the blackness. But then, I saw headlights flash behind me. The truck had pulled out onto the road, and its lights were growing brighter, gaining on me. At first, I kept a steady pace, hoping they'd pass. But the truck matched my speed, maintaining a perfect distance, always just a bit too close. I could feel my anxiety start to spiral, each shadow on the road looking like it might hide another figure. The headlights flashed again, this time brighter, their intensity filling the inside of my car. I put my foot down, speeding up until I was hitting nearly 80. But the truck just kept following, the rumble of its engine a constant, menacing drone behind me. Just then, the road took a sharp turn. I eased off the gas, hoping to stay in control, but the truck sped up and surged forward, closing the distance between us. I could feel the weight of its headlights on me, piercing through the back windshield, and my mind spun with images of that silent figure by the road. Suddenly, the truck's engine roared, and it swerved into the other lane, coming up alongside me. I kept my gaze straight ahead, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, trying to block out the figure I felt staring at me from the other vehicle. The truck stayed beside me for what felt like ages, and then, just as quickly, it swerved back behind me, its headlights disappearing. I dared a quick glance in the rearview mirror, but it was gone. The road behind me was as empty as if nothing had ever been there. I didn't ease off the gas until I saw the faint glow of lights ahead. A small, empty rest stop came into view, and I pulled over, hoping a moment to breathe would clear my head. I stepped out of the car, my hands shaking as I leaned against the door. The icy air hit me, sharp and real, grounding me. Then, in the silence, I heard it, the faint hum of an engine. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing. Only the trees, their dark shapes swaying slightly in the wind. I got back in my car and drove the last stretch without stopping or looking back, the echo of that silent figure and the truck's blinding lights still haunting me. When I finally pulled into Fairbanks, I felt as though I'd barely made it out of the darkness. That road, that night, it left a mark on me. When I told my friend about the experience, he gave me a strange look. "You saw a truck, huh? And a man on the side of the road?" he asked, his face darkening. He told me stories of that road, whispers about a phantom truck and a figure by the roadside who'd been haunting drivers for years. Apparently, the stories all started with a fatal accident decades ago. A trucker, they said, whose body had never been found in the wreckage, only his hat lying in the snow beside the road. The thought still gives me chills. Emma, Alex, Jason, and Kira had been planning their Alaskan adventure for months. They were all drawn to the allure of the untouched wilderness, the frozen lakes, and the chance to escape their everyday lives. Camping out by a remote lake sounded like the perfect adventure. After hours of traveling, they finally arrived at the frozen lake just before noon. The low-hanging winter sun barely pierced through the thick gray clouds overhead, casting an eerie, cold light across the endless expanse of snow and ice. "Just us and nature," Alex declared, tossing his backpack onto the snow. "There's really no one else around." Setting up camp on the edge of the lake, they pitched their tents under tall, snow-laden pines. As night fell, they gathered around a small fire, enjoying the rare tranquility of the untouched wilderness, with nothing but the shimmering northern lights overhead. But the quiet wouldn't last. Late into their first night, the silence was broken by the faint crunching of footsteps through the snow. They assumed it was an animal, maybe a moose or even a wolf, but soon a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and rugged with a short beard and dressed in muted gray clothes that almost blended into the night, stepped forward. "Sorry to intrude," he said with a disarming smile, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I got lost while looking for my camp and ended up here by mistake." The friends exchanged surprised glances, but the man's friendly demeanor quickly put them at ease. He introduced himself as Mike and explained that he was also here for the winter scenery and fishing, but had somehow wandered off the trail. They invited him to join them by the fire, offering him a cup of coffee as he recounted tales of his solo adventures in the wild. There was something mesmerizing about the way he spoke, his voice calm but tinged with a strange, almost hypnotic undertone. But by morning, he was gone. No sign of his camp or his things, not even a footprint in the snow. Shrugging it off as a harmless quirk, the group continued their plans. The next night, however, things took a darker turn. Around midnight, Jason noticed strange footprints circling their tents. The tracks seemed to weave in and out between the trees, as if someone had been watching them as they slept. Just as he shared this discovery, a shadowy figure appeared at the edge of their camp. It was barely visible against the darkened tree line, but the unmistakable sensation of being watched gripped them. "Is that Mike?" Emma whispered, clutching Alex's arm. But the figure didn't respond. It melted back into the forest, leaving the group with a deep sense of dread. "We need to leave," Alex insisted, grabbing his gear with trembling hands. The others didn't argue. There was an unspoken fear that had settled among them, gnawing at their nerves. As they packed in frantic silence and set off along the snowy trail, an oppressive, lurking feeling began to build. Shadows flitted between the trees, following them just out of sight. Kira stole a glance behind her and saw several faint shapes moving parallel to them. Their pursuers were patient, methodical, never revealing themselves fully, but never allowing the group a moment's peace. Hours later, frozen and exhausted, they stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin tucked between dense pines. Its windows were covered in frost, its walls decayed and warped. With no other choice, they dashed inside, barricading the door with a heavy table and anything else they could find. The cabin was dark and smelled of mildew, the air thick with a sense of abandonment and decay. But barely minutes after they entered, a knock echoed through the small space. "Hey, it's me, Mike. Let me in, guys. It's freezing out here." His voice was calm, almost soothing, but something in his tone chilled them to the bone. Outside the door, they could make out his silhouette, and behind him, several others shifting in the darkness. "We're not letting you in," Alex shouted, his voice shaking. There was silence, then a low chuckle from Mike. "You really think you'll last out here without help?" His voice was ice cold, carrying a twisted amusement. "We could have all been friends, but now it's too late." The silence was replaced by pounding on the walls and windows. The shadows outside began pressing closer, their fists and heavy bodies slamming against the frail wooden structure. Desperate, Alex grabbed an iron rod he'd found on the floor, while Jason picked up a broken chair leg as a weapon. Emma and Kira huddled together, fear etched into their faces as the relentless assault continued. When the door finally splintered under the weight of a shoulder, the attackers began forcing their way inside. In a desperate bid to survive, the friends fought back with everything they had, swinging makeshift weapons against their faceless attackers, each hit meeting resistance as if they were striking solid ice. The sounds of struggle filled the cabin, fear driving their movements even as their strength waned. Then, a sudden burst of light flooded the room. A second group of campers, drawn by the noise and commotion, had come to investigate. They rushed in, joining the fight, and managed to push the attackers back long enough for everyone to escape into the freezing night. Together, they made their way out of the woods and didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, collapsing in exhaustion and terror. The next day, they reported everything to the local police, detailing their harrowing encounter. No one had ever heard of a Mike or any solo campers in that area, and while the police found no evidence to corroborate their story, the experience would forever mark them. That winter night in the Alaskan wilderness served as a stark reminder. Sometimes the wild harbors far more than animals and icy winds. Sometimes it conceals people who are predators in the most terrifying sense of the word.